Our fourth step involves setting up views. When we create a SharePoint list, SharePoint does give us a default view. That default view is called All Items, which you see right here. You can modify this view or create a new view. And the way you do that is by going to your settings, Site Libraries and Lists, Projects Directory. And you've probably seen this screen many times already. You've got your columns, you've got your views, and you want to create views. I am going to do something slightly different for this demo, only because the platform that I'm using for SharePoint has the views displayed here, and they have a shortcut here. So I'm going to use this. But for the most part, everyone else will probably access their editing capabilities for views through the settings. And when you actually set up the views, you're going to see something. Your views are going to look something like this. This is an example of Office 365 SharePoint. The one that I'm using, the platform that I'm using, is a little bit different. So I just wanted to point out that as we're doing this. So I'm going to modify the view here. And when you modify the view, you're going to get this screen. When you create a view, you have to give it a name. Views are typically sorted alphabetically. I sometimes want to see views in a particular order as opposed to letting SharePoint alphabetically sort them out for me. So my workaround solution to that is just putting a number in front of it like that. The next section is the columns. As you can see, all the columns that we create or the ones that are provided by SharePoint are available for display. All you're doing is selecting which columns you want to show in your views. And over to the far right, you can order them from left to right in a certain manner. What we are going to do here is, if you remember this title column, that was a default column provided by SharePoint. I do not want to display this. And I'm going to leave the 1 here because when we save this, this will automatically be renumbered. Your other option is to just number this, say, for example, number 9, which would be right after the legal hold. But for this case, I'm going to leave this alone. This is a very easy way to show columns and move the columns around within your views. The next section here is sort. This applies to how the data in your column will be sorted. This is typically subjective, so I'm not going to spend that much time, but for the most part, I'm just going to say I want the project ID to be ascending, and I want the name of the person submitting the project to be ascending. Then we get down to filter. Filter is really what makes the views functional. The default view for SharePoint is going to show you all items. I do recommend that you have at least one view that shows all of the columns in a SharePoint list. I typically use that view as a way of data entering. And you also do need a view to see every single column that you have in the list. We will get to this other filtering part when we create the next view. There are a couple of other sections down here. The only one that's going to apply to us with the SharePoint list is the totals. You are more than welcome to explore what these other sections are. What I like to do is when I look at my views, I would like to know how many rows of data I have. SharePoint will identify which columns that you've created can be calculated. What I like to do personally is put my count in the very first column. In this case, it's the project ID. Then I'm just going to hit OK. And we're going to see that my view has changed with the number 1, that I have 4 rows of data, and that column, that title column, that was the very first one on the left, is no longer being displayed. In the previous video section, I mentioned that SharePoint by default had a title column which was also required. And I went in and took off that designation. The reason I did that is if you have any columns that are considered required and you completely forget about it and you completely hide them from all of the views, you will have problems updating your information. So make sure that when you require a field or a column that it is available in some of the more important views or the ones that where you do the data entry. So I hope that what you just saw was fairly easy, and what we're going to do is I am going to create the 6 other views that are part of the sample SharePoint list exactly the way it's outlined in the job aid. So I'm not going to try to dwell too much on exactly how I'm doing it because it's all spelled out for you in the job aid, but I'm going to just do this very quickly so you can see how this is constantly being, how the views are being created. When you do create a new view, you will have a choice between different types of views. Again, you're welcome to explore this. For the purposes of the demo and the SharePoint list, we're only going to be using the standard view. So I'm going to click on this and create a view from scratch. And our second view is called Approve Active. When you start creating views, you can designate them as the default view. You do not have to use SharePoint's all items as the default view. When you create views, you're going to have an option of determining the audience. The difference between a personal and a public view is that personal is for your eyes only. When you log into your computer and open up SharePoint, those views are only going to be made available to you. When you create a public view, that becomes available to anyone that has access to your SharePoint team site. There's a good reason why you would want to create a public view, and there are reasons why you'd want to create a personal view. If I'm one of 5 project managers managing 200 projects, I probably only want to see the projects that I'm managing. However, someone may need to see all 200 projects, or there may need to be a reason to have at least one view with all of the projects. Columns are going to be the same. I'm just going to go through the sort, the column sort. For the filters, I am actually going to establish a filter here, and I am going to say I want the status column to equal approved. And there's an and or operator here, and I want the end date, the project end date, to be greater than equal to today. When you type in today with these brackets, just like you see here, along with this me function, what this does is it compares the end date of the project to today's date, where today's date is dynamic. So if a project ended today, technically it would still be considered an active project, but come tomorrow, it would be considered inactive. Totals, count, okay. So we start out with 4 projects, and now we see that we have 2 projects that have been approved and still considered active. Now let's create our third view, but instead of creating it from scratch, I'm just going to create it from an existing view. So here's our third view. And everything is the same. The difference is the filter here. I'm going to say the end date is less than today's date. So we started with 4 projects, 2 of them are active, and we see that 1 of them is inactive. Now, we have 4 projects, but there's only 3 showing. Well, it's because one of those projects are not approved, okay? Which is our next list. Standard view. Again, just follow what I've outlined in the job aid. This is just a sample, but once you create these lists, you can set the column sorts the way you think is appropriate. And for the filter, I'm just going to say I want the status column is equal to not approved. Now, the way this works is it is actually in order, but when you click on, at least for demo purposes, when you click on number 3, it's this sort of this third column that gets updated all the time. So it is technically in order, but now we see 4 items. 2 have been approved active, 1 of them is approved active, and 1 of them is not approved. Just gonna quickly create the last 2 columns, 3 columns. Number 5, we're calling legal holds. Again, all the columns are we're displaying all 7 columns. I'm just gonna do project ID, name, ascending, and for the filter, this is gonna be a fairly straightforward filter. I want the legal hold to equal yes. And there's our legal holds. And since we don't have any projects on legal hold, this view will not display any projects. Number 6, our 6th view is actually the most interesting one. It's called pending destruction. This view has several things going on with the filter. So we'll get to that in just a second. Let me just do the disposition date, sending, project ID, sending. This is where I am going to create 3 filters, but on the condition that all 3 filters are met. So the first criteria is I want the disposition date to be less than or equal to today. And I want the destruction date to equal absolutely nothing. I want a completely blank field, so I'm not going to enter any text. And I just clicked on the show more columns. You are allowed 10 filters. If you do more than 2, just make sure that you are careful with your and or operators. My third criteria is I need the legal hold to equal no. Okay. I'm just going to double check this filter for 1 second. So this is why you need to be a little bit careful about the filter. You see, I have the or, it should be an and. So when you change that to and, you see only 1 shows up. Just a few seconds ago when we were looking at this, all 4 rows of data showed up. And this is why you need to be very careful with the filters. So out of the 4 projects, there is one that's actually pending destruction because it is inactive. Well, because it's already not been approved and it already had an end date and it had the disposition date of 2009, okay? So anything with a disposition, if we go to the all columns, you can see that the only project that has a disposition date that is earlier than this year are these 2 rows. But remember that we set up a filter that says we don't want to see records or projects that have already been destroyed, which is the reason why this is the only one that's showing up. Let's create our final view, which is called destroyed. And I'm using destruction date ascending, project ID ascending. And for my filter, this is a simple one. I'm saying that I want the destruction date column to not equal a blank. In other words, I only want to see the projects that have a date in that field. This is just another way of saying it and a way that works for the SharePoint views. So I've now created my 6 views. I'm seeing that I have 4 total projects. 2 are approved and active. 1 is not approved and inactive. 1 is not approved. Don't have any legal holds. Whoops, let me modify something real quick. Our 6th view. Our pending destruction, we have 1. And our destroyed, which is our 7th view. We have 1. Now let me go back to the all items view just to show you the data entry part. There are 2 ways to enter data. You can click on new item and SharePoint will take you to this default screen of entering data. Or you can click on edit list. Now when we started this segment of the demo, I had pre-populated 4 out of the 6 rows of data that I provide in the job aid. I'm going to go ahead and just populate the remaining 2 data. And I want you to pay specific attention to the disposition date column, specifically this cell, because as soon as I enter the end date, the disposition date is going to be automatically calculated as I move my cursor through the columns. So the data that we want to enter for number 5 is Miller. Okay, her project was approved. Her project end date was for 2006. Just carefully watch this cell as I move this over. And you can see that this was automatically populated. I will do it one more time. And again, this is going to be auto-populated because we have the formula that factors in the status column and the end date column. And for this particular, for the last one, I'm going to say that there is actually a legal hold on this. So I'm going to click on Stop Editing, and now you'll see that we have 6 rows of data. Still 2 that are approved inactive, but we have 3 approved inactive this time. Not approved remains at 1. It turns out we do have a legal hold now. Pending destruction, there's only 2. And just in case you want to know why, if you look at the last 4 rows here, they've all have had projects that have ended and are eligible for destruction. The only reason 2 of them appear, which are these 2, is because one of them is on legal hold, and we said we don't want to see anything that has a legal hold, and the other one has already been destroyed. So I set this up because I want to see the projects that I need to move in the share drive, not the projects that I've already moved in the share drive or that have been already destroyed. What I would do with something like this is maybe export it out into a spreadsheet. Let's say I go to the approved inactive, I export this out into a spreadsheet, then I go into my share drive and I just look at the numbers of the projects, and then I just start moving them into inactive. I would do the same for anything that needs to be destroyed, but I would obviously be going into the inactive folder and destroying them. So you can see how we're using the SharePoint list to help us manage the files, the project files in the shared drive. The best part about this list is because we put the formula in to calculate the disposition date. We've set our filters. As soon as we change our information here, or I should say, as soon as any of the users change information here, everything is automatically calculated. For example, if I change the approved date, if there was a mistake, and then someone inadvertently tagged this as approved, if we change this to not approved, this disposition date is going to change because we're keeping approved files for 10 years, but not approved files for 3 years. So this changed to 2021, so it only reflects 3 years. Same thing, if you take a project off legal hold and say no, save it, then you go into your legal holds view, you don't see any projects at all. So I hope you can better see now how I've leveraged using formulas, leveraged using views, and the functionality in those views to help me manage all of these project folders, all of the projects, strictly from the SharePoint list, and then as it's tied to the shared drive. Sorry for the long demo for this section, but I'd be happy to answer more questions when we get to the Q&A section.